And Grant, you have the floor.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you to the organizers, and thank you to the audience for coming today. If you have thoughts about my project that you're unable to share directly after this session, I welcome emails. My email is my first initial, then my last name, Grant Dowling at stanford.edu. And my topic is the practical context of Socratic Elenchus, particularly what to do when inquiry hits an impasse. And what I am trying to do in this talk is situate Elenchus within a broader practical framework, practical meaning relating to action, that Socrates and his interlocutors have practical questions that open Socratic dialogues. And the dialogue I'll be focusing on in this talk is the Laches, which is one of the most kind of paradigmatically practically directed dialogues. But what I'll be trying to say today, I mean to generalize for Socrates' method across the Socratic dialogues, though some like Laches, Euthyphro, and Crito more obviously start with a practical question than others. I think Socrates' normative commitments have implications for his practical philosophy, that is what he's committed to in terms of his ethics, has impacts on what he should be committed to in terms of action. And I think that action context is operative across the Socratic dialogues. And so by connecting that to the impasse that he reaches aporia habitually over and over again in these Elenctic question and answer sessions with his interlocutors, I aim to try to show that what seems like a problem for Socratic Elenchus, especially on the traditional view of Elenchus, sketched out by Vlastos and kind of responded to since then in the secondary literature, in fact constitutes practical progress. And so this impasse isn't really a problem for Elenchus, it's a feature, not a bug, something like that. Okay, first, so this is the standard account of Elenchus, and it standardly begins with this "what is X" question. So the main kind of gestalt of my presentation today is to move back an account of Elenchus before we get to the "what is X" question, so that we can understand what the end, what the practical purpose of engaging of Elenchus is in the first place. And once we have that understanding and that framework in place, then we can see what the practical upshots are of aporia at the end of Elenchus, and how it might not be this problem that it appears to be in much of the secondary literature. So as you can read off the slide, traditionally an account of Elenchus begins with a "what is X" question, where X is virtue or some kind of virtue, and it ends in a failure to give a satisfactory account of whatever is standing in for X there. And at this point, scholarship tends to end its account with Elenchus. So it begins with "what is X" and ends at impasse. And at this moment of impasse, this moment of failure to answer the "what is X" question, scholars like Vlastos will step back and judge whether Elenchus can yield knowledge. And so in the secondary literature, this is the constructivism versus non-constructivism debate. It's essentially in these Elenctic sessions that begin with a "what is X" question and end with an impasse. Can we get knowledge out of that process? But what I'm attempting to do in this presentation is broaden the framework before and after, so that we're looking at the practical context which occasions the "what is X" question, and then the practical upshots reaching impasse has. Okay. If we start with this "what to do" question, and we're only led to ask "what is X" in order to solve the "what to do" question. So in the Laches, of course, that's how we ought to raise our sons, and in particular, whether we ought to turn them over to an education in fighting with light or heavy armor. Once you reach an impasse to the "what is X" question, the "what to do" question that occasioned Socratic Elenchus hasn't been discharged. It's still there. And so there's a remaining question of what we should do when we reach an impasse. And what I'm arguing in my presentation is that a Vlastosian with this standard model of Elenchus has an answer to what we do at an impasse, and that for Socrates is to iterate this process over and over again. And after enough iterations, it does seem like for Vlastos, it can give you this Elenchic knowledge, which is enough confidence in the some propositions which have been elenchically debated that Socrates can kind of practically act on them or something like that. But all those interpretations of that Vlastos gives of what you should do when you hit an impasse aren't dictated by Elenchus itself. There's nothing within the method that tells you that's what you ought to do when you reach an impasse. And so I've modeled the standard account of Elenchus with the kind of lettering and the traditional way that Vlastos has since was doing in the 1980s. So first you get elicit some answer from a interlocutor in terms of this what is X question. That's where the account starts on the traditional view. Then you ask some secondary questions. So in the Lakes, this is a question about contraries, whether every contrary has only one and only one contrary, something like that, but these are about general principles. Then you elicit further responses in light of the answer you've gotten from an interlocutor on that general principle. And then you show that there's consequences drawn that allow you to assert the contrary of the answer to the what is X question. So you seem like you can't hold all these beliefs at once without coming into conflict or something like that. So that's the standard accounts. And now I'm going to try to offer a way to broaden our understanding of Elenchus by putting it in a practical framework. Okay, so these are the stages that I'm kind of modeling for what goes on before and after Elenchus. And so the standard account really just takes up stages 3 and 4 on this slide, whereas I'll be using the Lakes to illustrate there's a kind of richer structure that Elenchus is embedded within, and that reaching impasse through Elenchus can play a important functional role in this structure. That's not just a kind of problem, but actually offers practical guidance towards future stages. All right, so generally the stages that I've mapped out for these Socratic dialogues, especially the paradigmatically practical ones, are that first, Socrates encounters an interlocutor deliberating about or committed to some full-fledged political action, something that they want to do. So I've mentioned in Lakes what this is, and Euthyphro, this is of course prosecuting his father. Then Socrates secures agreement that the best way to decide how to act is according to knowledge. So this is really crucial for me. And I'll be talking about why Socrates over and over makes this claim or tries to lead his interlocutors into agreement that knowledge is practically decisive, that it is the ideal way to decide what to do and how to live or something like that. And it seems like only after Socrates has secured agreement about the practical decisiveness and priority of knowledge, only then does he open up the what is X question, lead his interlocutor into impasse about it. And then what's interesting to me again is that the practical question that's been opened up at stage 1, it seems like we actually make some progress on it, even if we hit a Elenchic impasse. And that especially is borne out or vivified by the end of many Socratic dialogues, where he's oftentimes recommending 2 pretty invariant courses of action. Either he recommends a continuation of inquiry with interlocutors like Euthyphro and Protagoras. Socrates wants to continue investigating the question that he's opened up with them, or even more frequently, he'll recommend that he himself and his interlocutor go seek an expert in general. Maybe they need to find out who it is, or sometimes he has one in mind, like Prodicus, let's say. Oh, you need to go see Prodicus and encounter this expert. So somehow reaching impasse seems to offer pretty clear practical outcomes for Socrates and his interlocutors at the end of these dialogues. The claim that knowledge is practically decisive, on my view, can be supported by the Socratic assumptions about ethics that are pretty present across the Socratic dialogues. And while the details of them might get debated about in the secondary literature, broadly, most scholars agree that you can find Socrates holding these views across the Socratic dialogue. So the first assumption is Socrates' normative eudaimonism, that all agents ought to be happy. And so this can be contrasted with psychological or descriptive eudaimonism, that in fact, everyone goes for happiness or something like that if you're to observe them. This is the normative claim that in fact you ought to try to be happy. That's what human beings ought to do. The second assumption connected to happiness is the dependency, or it also gets called the conditionality thesis. And that's that virtue is at least necessary, perhaps constitutive of eudaimonia. And so it seems like it's a requirement that an agent is virtuous if they're going to be happy, and they ought to be happy. And then the last assumption that's connected is to virtue is Socrates' virtue intellectualism, that knowledge is necessary or constitutive of virtue. Therefore, we get this kind of direct chain from the normative edict to be happy that Socrates holds, his eudaimonism, to knowledge, which is necessary for the virtue, which is necessary for happiness. And so I think this has practical upshots for how agents normatively ought to act, and that engaging in Elenchus can make progress for the practical deliberation of agents if they've been led to agree or accept these Socratic normative principles. And if you do have a difficult interlocutor who isn't committed to Socrates's normative assumptions or Socrates's kind of basic framework of normative eudaimonism, then we can still apply the theory to them normatively, so that at the end of the dialogue, Socrates, after leading this interlocutor to Elenchus, can still diagnose what they ought to do practically, having been led into impasse, even if the interlocutor in propria persona hasn't signed on to these assumptions. But as I was trying to argue before, at stage 2, we see Socrates' normative eudaimonism kind of undergirding or motivating, in my opinion, the connection between knowledge and practical decisiveness, that to deliberate well, to act well, to live well, if possible, you should do it with knowledge. Okay, so part of my dissertation research and part of the larger research program that this presentation is a part of is applying these 3 Socratic normative principles to action, particularly for ignorant agents. If you're ignorant and you sign on to Socrates's normative commitments, or if Socrates is just diagnosing what an ignorant agent ought to do, I've been thinking through, if you lack knowledge and knowledge is necessary for virtue and virtue is necessary for happiness, what that normatively entails in terms of what an ignorant agent ought to do. And as you can see at the very left-hand side of this decision tree that I've been sketching out, Elenchus is what initiates this practical project. And so on the common account, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor when I put it over the PowerPoint, you can. Okay, so the common standard account of Elenchus kind of ends at this very first step on the decision tree, that Elenchus reveals ignorance, and then we hit aporia. So that would be the stage that we're left at. And what I'm trying to show in this presentation in my larger dissertation research is, in fact, that hitting the impasse opens up this further decision tree for ignorant agents and gives them practical guidance on what to do. And once you've reached impasse through aporia and you've accepted Socrates' normative commitments, that really just leaves you with 2 courses of action that you normatively ought to pursue if you're able to. And that's either to seek an expert to give you the knowledge which is required for virtue and happiness, or if you prefer, you could inquire directly. Maybe you haven't found any experts, or just, I'm not sure whether for Socrates, these preferences in this decision tree would be rank ordered and transitive, like in contemporary decision theory. And so it's still kind of an open question for me whether there is a practical priority between seeking an expert or inquiring directly. But I still think there's very significant practical progress that we've opened with this what to do question, where an agent is kind of deliberating about all these kind of practical possibilities, and that Elenchus then radically constrains the normative action that a ignorant agent ought to be taking. That is, they ought to be seeking an expert or inquiring directly, and that's really the kind of 2 main things they should be doing. And so that kind of focusing effect on what an ignorant agent should do next, I see as practical progress that an impasse from aporia after Socratic Elenchus offers. And I've kind of modeled this all out in the Laches. I'm not going to read out all the passages to save time, but here I've included the opening of the Laches and the practical issue that Lysimachus is mentioning even before Socrates comes into the dialogue. So Socrates is just hanging out nearby, and Lysimachus is deliberating over this practical problem. Laches brings in Socrates, so Socrates is going to help solve this practical problem. So I think the Laches especially emphasizes the practical starting points for Socratic Elenchus. That's stage one in the 5 stages as I've laid out. All right, then for stage 2, Socrates tries to show that to decide these practical questions, knowledge will be decisive. And so Socrates takes issue with Lysimachus's proposed kind of democratic approach of voting on what to do. He says, "What's that, Lysimachus? Do you intend to cast your vote for whatever position is approved by the majority of us? It is by knowledge," and this is the kind of most full-fledged vocabulary for knowledge, "it's by episteme that one ought to make decisions, krinesthai." And so here we have this moment in the Laches, as there's moments in other Socratic dialogues, where knowledge is connected as practically decisive for deliberation, and that if one can act according to knowledge, one ought to act according to knowledge. So here we've reached stage 2. Socrates goes on to secure agreement that the best way to decide, so in this case it's krinesthai, is to krinesthai on the basis of episteme. And so it's only after Socrates has gotten agreement about the practical decisiveness of knowledge that he goes on to pose the what is X question. So he rejecting the democratic approach to deliberation of just voting on what to do. He says, so I'll start a little bit down on this quote, "Aren't these two now asking our advice as to the manner in which virtue might be added to the souls of their sons to make them better? Then isn't it necessary for us to start out knowing what virtue is?" So Socrates has converted this practical problem that initiated the Socratic dialogue to a practical problem regarding virtue, and has connected virtue to knowledge. So now what's necessary, according for Socrates, is to start with knowledge. And his test, his way to examine whether they have knowledge on this issue is to see if they can come up with a definition of some kind of value term. In this case, it's courage. That will be the relevant virtue for this kind of practical consideration. So the practical consideration is connected to virtue, and knowledge of that virtue, according to Socrates, is necessary for deciding the practical question in this context. Okay, so that's that's how we get to the what is X question in the Laches. Then, as I was mentioning, Socrates kind of goes through the Vlastosian model of what Elenchus is here, takes an answer to the question what courage is. It's a part of virtue. Then he asks secondary questions about general principles, about contraries, and shows that the beliefs that the interlocutor has about those general principles lead to conflict with the initial answer to the what is X question. So therefore, Socrates says, then we have not discovered, Nicias, what courage is. That is, like all the other interlocutors in the Socratic dialogues, we don't get a satisfactory answer to the what is X question. And so this leads to the problem of Elenchus for Vlastos. Vlastos's solution in terms of iterating Elenchus over and over again is mostly run in order to create a consistent enough belief set that you can trust in because of the repeated success of getting tested in these situations. But what Vlastos, when he was coming up with that solution to the problem of Elenchus, was trying to solve was this problem. It seems like Terry Irwin had opened up maybe in the 1970s, that Elenchus doesn't tell you how to revise your beliefs when they come into conflict. There's no indication which of the beliefs which are in conflict you should revise for the sake of consistency, or let alone truth. And it seems like there's, even on Vlastos's account, nothing within Elenchus that helps guide those sorts of revisions, just kind of iterating the process over and over again. So I'm here proposing kind of an alternative understanding of what to do when you reach impasse through Elenchus. And my solution is not through the kind of epistemic problems of constructivism, of how it is that you could make these question and answer sessions end up generating knowledge about what to do, but rather what to do when it's revealed that you lack the knowledge which Socrates has secured agreement is practically decisive for deciding what to do. And deciding what to do is the reason that we got into Elenchus in the first place. And so it's significant to me that over and over again, although Socrates encounters an impasse at the end of these Elenchic sessions with his interlocutors, nonetheless, there is some practical progress that's made. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, it's usually towards further inquiry to try to discover these matters directly and get definitional knowledge of virtue terms, which would license normative action, because that's how you ought to act if you can. Or on the other hand, it's to search out experts who have knowledge that can teach you and tell you what to do. And so here in the Laches, once again, we see Socrates making this recommendation. He says, what I say we ought to do, my friends, since this is just between ourselves, is join in search for the best possible teacher, first for ourselves, we really need one, and then for the young men, sparing neither money nor anything else. What I don't advise is that we remain as we are. And if anyone laughs at us because we think it is worthwhile to spend our time in school, we'll, retort with Homer that it's no shame to learn. So what's interesting here is that we saw Lysimachus deliberating about what to do for his sons at the beginning of the dialogue, which was a practical question. And at the end of the dialogue, we do get a practical outcome, but it has been shifted. There's been a shift in the practical priority to deliberate about what to do for one's sons to acquiring knowledge yourself. That seems like it's kind of overridden these other sorts of deliberations that Lysimachus was making. So one of my main conclusions is that Elenchic impasse offers practical guidance, that there's all sorts of things to deliberate about, a whole horizon of possible actions for an agent to take. But once a Socratic interlocutor has accepted the decisiveness of knowledge for action, and then it's been revealed that they lack that crucial virtue knowledge relevant to the practical situation that they're in, it seems like their action and their intentions become focused on acquiring knowledge, if acquiring knowledge is possible. And the two routes that I imagine for that are finding an expert or inquiring directly to discover knowledge. And I imagine that in the Socratic dialogues, Elenchus is going to be the means for doing either of those things. So therefore, it's important to me that there's different stages at which one can use Elenchus. And it's dialogues like the Laches and Euthyphro, where Elenchus is revealing to an agent that they lack knowledge. But you might use the Elenchic method for other purposes, namely testing experts who, when you're outside of a practical possibility, when you're outside of the original practical situation that occasioned Elenchus, like in the Laches, if you've accepted that you lack knowledge, you might test experts at this kind of secondary stage when you've accepted Socrates' normative commitments and therefore have radically shrunk the sphere of your intention action. Let's see, for the matter of time, I'll skip returning to the decision tree for now, and I'll focus on these, what I'm calling upshots of the Socratic decision tree. And so all the way to the left, the decision tree starts out with Elenchus, and then once it reveals someone's ignorance by reaching aporia or impasse, I've kind of modeled out what practical guidance this impasse gives and what practical advancement an agent has made from the beginning of the dialogue when they deliberately don't know what to do to the end of the dialogue where they've accepted the practical decisiveness of action and then reached impasse at reaching definitional knowledge for pertinent virtues for their practical situation. And so there's kind of two main upshots I want to focus on. One might have to do with Socratic practical rationality. And so the advice that Socrates gives over and over again after reaching impasse to continue inquiring directly to acquire knowledge or to go seek out an expert who could teach knowledge, to me seems like it really coheres with the contemporary canon in contemporary analytic philosophy about practical rationality, and that's about means and coherence. So I've used this take a means version of the principle that rationality requires, if you intend some end E and believe that a necessary means to that end E is M, so M is the means, and that you will M only if you intend to M, then you intend to M. So that's one of these contemporary norms of practical rationality. And it seems like something like this is operative in Socrates' reasoning. So if you intend virtue and happiness and believe that a necessary means to virtue and happiness is knowledge, then you will pursue knowledge or try to acquire knowledge, and that you will only acquire knowledge if you intend to, that you won't just get it accidentally or something like that. Then you intend to acquire knowledge. And so it seems like you can have this transformative effect on an interlocutor's intentions if you get them to sign on to Socrates' normative commitments and then lead them into an impasse through Elenchus, or even if they haven't signed on to those normative commitments fully, at least you can diagnose what they ought to do from that perspective. Nick Smith, his paper Socrates on Practical Deliberation might be an objection where you would undermine the requirement for knowledge, because it seems like in many cases Socrates has kind of pre-existing beliefs that he can't fully justify through rational accounts about what's right or wrong. But I really want to emphasize that for the most part, beliefs in the absence of knowledge are only sufficient for kind of normatively licensed action in cases where there's some kind of obstacle or hindrance to pursuing knowledge. And so I think the Crito is a really strong case there, where Socrates can't live his life pursuing knowledge by questioning experts or inquiring directly if he's stuck in prison or going to die from the death penalty. So in cases like that, in which there's an obstacle to the necessary means for virtue, then some kind of practical deliberation and decision-making without knowledge is required. So those moments in which Socrates is acting on beliefs without knowledge, I really think it's because those actions are necessary to get back to the all things considered desire that he has or intention that he has to acquire knowledge. Then the second upshot on my view, and this is what I'm kind of ending with, is something like the necessity of elenchic skill. So if the two options for a Socratic ignorant agent, once they've signed on to the Socrates' three main normative commitments about normative eudaimonism, are to examine experts or to inquire directly, it seems like to do either of those well, you'll need some kind of elenchic skill, that if constructive elenchus is possible and you can use elenchus to get knowledge, you can't be a sloppy practitioner of elenchus. You can't fail to draw necessary distinctions and have kind of a nuanced attention to concepts and that sort of thing. So in order to inquire directly and acquire knowledge, it seems like first you'll have to develop the ability to inquire well, or to practice elenchus adequately or something like that. On the other hand, if you want to test experts to see if an expert is genuinely an expert or not, it seems like you can't do a shoddy or subpar job of questioning them, or else too many faux experts might be able to pass your elenchic questioning. And so there's a question of pistis or trust. What's going to undergird the results of elenchic inquiry or elenchic testing of experts? And on my view, to get to knowledge on any of these routes on this decision tree I've drawn up, elenchic skill is a preliminary step to eventually acquiring knowledge through elenchus, either directly or by testing an expert. And so therefore, it seems like reaching an impasse not only shows that one ought to radically constrain one's intentions to just pursuing behaviors or actions that will result in knowledge, but also that there's even this preliminary step for acquiring Elenchic skill, because ultimately seeking experts or inquiring directly will only be successful with that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Once again, I'd like to ask for people to use the raise hand function. We've got 10 minutes. Dylan again. Oh, Dylan was.
There was a hand of applause, but I do have a question, but someone else might want to.
Yes, Andrew. I think Andrew Payne is first then, so let me start with him.
Great, thank you, Grant. That was really exciting. I wonder. I wanted to kind of just throw out a kind of a big picture observation, and then ask a question about the kind of the upshot of the impasse. The big picture observation is that one thing that we're supposed to do is kind of turn away from our pressing political projects and try to get some knowledge. I wonder if this is an enactment of, in a sense, the divine sign that comes to Socrates and doesn't tell him exactly what he should do, but restrains him and keeps him from doing the thing when he's just about to step into the puddle, or when he's just about to commit some grave crime. So possibly this upshot might be kind of in line with that feature of Socrates, the divine sign, his way of passing it on to other people. The particular question is, if I take it that one kind of problem posed by Blastos is, why think that the Elenchus, even if we're really good at it, gets us to knowledge? And your decision tree, I think, kind of rightly makes the point that people have to kind of go through different steps. But at a certain point, we're supposed to develop skill in Elenchus as a way to gain knowledge. Can we say anything more about why getting really good at Elenchus gets us closer to knowledge, better at finding these definitions, as opposed to simply being good at tripping people up in discussions?
Excellent question. So I'll just briefly mention a lot of my dissertation work I've labeled with this word apraxia, which comes up once in the Sophist when the visitor is making a semantic point about sentences able to capture actions or even inactions. So you get apraxia there. But then it's a very common charge made against the skeptics in ancient philosophy. And so I'm interested in these kind of apraxia antecedents for Socrates. Frequently he gets called a torpedo fish and all these kind of suggestions that he has this stultifying, paralyzing effect or something like that. But I do want to draw a distinction between complete apraxia, complete inaction, the sort of which is implied at some moments in Euthydemus, about if you lacked wisdom, it'd be better off to do nothing. In Cleitophon, about you might be better off dead if you don't have knowledge. That's how Cleitophon reports Socrates' position. And then in the Hippias Major, you have that kind of like aggressive voice that Socrates brings in, making the point that you'd be better off dead if you don't know what knowledge of the fine is. So that's something like complete apraxia or inaction. And then there's this more moderate version where you're just really constraining what actions an agent can take to just those that will either allow them to acquire knowledge or to remove obstacles and hindrances to acquiring knowledge. So that's a little bit on the apraxia. In terms of divine signs, I think Socrates' emphasis on interpreting what the oracle says also is really interesting here, that he's not ready to act immediately on the oracle's advice. And I've been thinking of some parallels to Orestes here on the way that Orestes acts maybe rashly on Apollo's advice in that play, versus the way that Socrates thinks that some interpretive skill, some knowledge or something like that is a requisite preliminary to understanding how to act on what the Pythian oracle or Chaerephon is reported from the Pythian oracle. And then the last comment I'll make is that I think the metaphysics of soul might play in here a lot. When we talk about developing a Elenchic skill, what's the seat of skill for Socrates? It's there does seem to be soul throughout the Socratic dialogues, even though there's not much dogmatic metaphysics that you see from Socrates. And so acquiring a Elenchic skill seems like you'd be exercising and develop capacities of the soul. And that's also what's going to be doing decision-making and that sort of thing. So I think that's probably where my intuitions lie about that.
There are 5 minutes left and 2 questions. So may I ask that questions and answers be very brief. Dylan?
Thank you, Grant. Yeah, and enjoyed your talk and all the best for the project. Let me try and formulate this quickly. So just as a brief sketch of like what you're saying, you know, I take it that you're pointing something like this. You know, for those who presume to know but don't know, it is better for them to search. So in a certain sense, you know, if the question of the dialogue is how should we educate your children, then if it's shown that you don't really know what that means, then presumably the next best thing for you to do is to figure out how to educate your children, or alternatively, how to become someone who knows how to learn how to educate his or her children. So in a certain sense, I think that might, I mean, one question I have then is that roughly in keeping with your intentions? And then a quick corollary would be just this idea of learning, of learning the skill needed to, in some sense, answer the practical question, which generates the conceptual question of the dialogue. So if I understand you correctly, I mean, one thing I think you might want to do is to take seriously the idea of a skill model rather than a doxastic model. That might be helpful to you. But my specific question had to do with you know, the kind of defects in the interlocutor's thinking that Socrates seems to expose. I mean, that itself seems to be an ethical progress. So when Laches enters the discussion, he's thinking about courage from the perspective of a general, ironically, given that he's supposed to be giving advice on how to raise kids. So, I mean, one of the things that Socrates seems to do then is he sort of guides him away from that overly narrow perspective. And I guess that might be a way of understanding what it would mean for him to improve in his understanding of courage.
Thank you, Dylan. So your model seems accurate to me. That seems like it totally fits with my view. I also agree that you mentioned another possible benefit of Elenchus, and I don't want to rule that out. I'm not sure that benefit, that is improving the interlocutors that way, is enough to explain what you should do when you reach Elenchus. And so I think there's that the resources I'm offering and proposing are necessary, even with that benefit of Elenchus that you described, which I don't want to disagree with. And then quickly, 2 passages for Elenchic skill I have are Euthyphro 11d 6-7 and Apology 30e1 to 31b. In both those moments, Socrates seems to mention that he himself has developed this skill, and there's a difference or contrast between him and, you know, a beginner interlocutor going through these instances of Elenchus. So that's my strongest evidence for something like Elenchic skill existing in the mind of Socrates in the dialogues.
Sorry, 2 minutes. So please, question and answer have to be very brief. We've got one more speaker. Veshna?
Thank you very much. I will be very brief. My question is in line with the previous question. So the problem with Elenchus is we cannot practice it by ourselves, because people tend to stick to their fallacies, prejudice, etc., for all the wrong reasons. And then is the question, we need a solution for a practical problem, for the problem of action, of political situation. And in order to do that, we need to know the virtue. So Socrates knows what virtue is, because the proof for that is that he acts virtuous. I'm not talking about what he says, I'm talking about what we can conclude from the dialogues. So what is the problem? The problem is when we do not know what virtue is. So it reminds me a bit on Meno's paradox, but in a positive light, because knowing, understanding what virtue is, you already need to act virtuous. So for me, the question is precisely the pedia or paideia, because in order to act virtuous, the first thing you need to, before even knowing, because you don't know, is wanting to act virtuous. So in that sense, I believe that no expert can give you that kind of pedia. Pedia in that sense for me is self-pedia, wanting to educate yourself. So either we do that, or, and this is not an alternative, they're not, it is not an exclusion, we go to the concept of metaphysics or soul, or some kind of innate practical knowledge, if that is possible at all. Just a comment, brief comment on that. I'm sorry for taking a lot of time.
And then in just 2 sentences to respond. So I'm solving the issue of what the interlocutor wants. I really appreciate that in terms of maybe this means end coherence, that if you sign them onto the principles, then for means end practical rationality, they have to intend to acquire knowledge if they want the ends to benefit from. And then I don't think Socrates necessarily has virtue of knowledge, because if the divine sign, as Andrew was saying, is informing him of what to do, when to do it and when not, he might be able to get right action without an account. And so therefore it might not be, he might have right virtuous action because he has this authority, even though he can't explain it or something like that.
Thanks. I need to end the session. Thank you so much to all of you. But we need to move to our next speaker, Irina Deratic. Thank you.